what I did want to do is have a discussion. Really, obviously, we talked the talk about class came up in the PMQs that we just watched. I want to have a quick discussion in that I think that there's a big difference between how young people and old people view class in the UK at the moment. In that boomers and Gen Xers really do hold true to the traditional understanding of British class, which is it's more of a cultural understanding of the kind of environments people grow up in, rather than what millennials and zoomers have, which is a far more kind of Marxist approach to class, right? We genuinely view, I think most people, of young people in this country, will look at something like class and they'll look through it in a mostly Marxist lens, right? They will look at, it be delineated by somewhat by the amount of wealth somebody has, the amount of income somebody gets, but in general, we'll look at it through the lens of our relationship to the means of production, right? Whereas boomers and Gen Xers will think about, where did you go to school? Where did you grow up? Do you have a regional accent, right? Insofar as you'll get like legacy Guardian journalists interviewing artisan pizzeria owners and describing them as being working class because they're from Bolton, right? They have the regional accent, so suddenly they can't be middle class anymore. They can't be bourgeois, right? Which is why there's this huge disconnect when we discuss kind of class in this country, and why it's infuriating to me that we never talk to young people. When young people are never even talked to in the media. They're talked about in the media all the time, mostly in a derisory manner, but they're never talked to. And this kind of disparity in the way people view class has created a pretty large divide in how people engage with politics in this country, and why it's very difficult for me to be able to get to grips with some of this shit, right? For example, one of the things that you will see, especially at the moment when we've got the Just Stop Oil protests happening, is people will look at the people who are doing the protesting and they'll say, oh, I can't believe the middle class. I can't believe all these transgender people are all coming out. They're all middle class, right? I'm like, by what metric are you calling these people middle class, right? In this kind of day and age, most people, right, in the country, most working people have had access to very similar stuff, especially because these are institutions that we've had because of the advancements under the new Labour government. As much as I really don't want to, I don't want to really admit that they did do good things, but we were at the point where, especially with regards to schooling, everyone had access to similar sorts of things, similar sorts of access to these kind of institutions growing up, right? I know there were still plenty of deprived areas in that time too, and that there's a real kind of people, members of the precariat, people who really grew up properly impoverished, right? But the vast majority of people have access to at least a basic level of the things that you'd expect. They weren't really given that much access. I mean, even Liz Truss talks about how run down her schooling was growing up in I think in the late 70s, early 80s, right? You went to school in the 90s, Russia, Cold War, ergo socialism bad. Amusingly, 90s Russia, probably post-shock doctrine is the biggest examples of disaster capitalism. But yeah. The reason why this is so frustrating to me is that first what I'm going to do is make a case as to why I believe that if we are going to talk about class, the lens that serves the most utility, especially in Britain and in the age of neoliberalism, is the Marxist lens with which to do so. In that, if you want to create some utility, you can't do something that you can't have this definition that means a load of different things to different people, right? If you ask somebody what makes someone quote unquote middle class or working class, they'll give you a huge amount of different answers. It's all fluff, it's all cultural, it's all essentially cultural trappings that surround the economic relationship that Marxists will talk about when we talk about class, for example, right? And so for people who are watching in the future VOD that I may or may not upload, depending on how well I actually articulate myself during the segment or in chat, is that from a Marxist lens, there are two classes, right? Two main classes broadly, with subdivisions in between them, and that is the bourgeois, those who own the means of production, the things that you use to make commodities. And then there's the proletariat who are paid a wage by the bourgeoisie to use these things to create commodities and get paid in wage labour, right? And at the moment in the UK, most people will at some point lie within this dichotomy, right? And it's really easy to understand because the reason why it serves utility is because their interests are diametrically opposed, right? The bourgeois, who in the vast majority of cases now, it's just shareholders, right? It's just shareholders who literally have money, then turn money into more money. and get paid dividends as the commodities get produced and sold and the surplus labor value then goes to shareholders, right? Not wanting to taking this discussion of this too far out of the weeds, so to say, in that they want to maximize the shareholder value, which means depressing wages, because you want to pay the minimum that you want to the people to the proletariat who man those tools. And the proletariat who want to man those tools want to make it as higher wages as possible and cut back as shareholder dividends as possible, because profits at the end of the day within this model are stolen wages. People will disagree, but that's just the Marxist point of view, and it's a point of view that I hold personally, right? The big issue is, if you're a young person today, and this is why this big distinction has come about, is that in a post-neoliberal world, post the Thatcherite reforms in the 1980s, is that everything has become far more individualized. In a world in which people grow up in specific communities where community is a big thing and economic communities are also a big thing, right? In a neoliberal world, everyone is being atomized, everyone is individualized. We are only singular economic units, right? Therefore, all we can think in a neoliberal world that we live in right now, all that we can think of is our own personal incentive structures and our own personal desires and our personal needs and our own material interests, which, as a member of the proletariat under a Marxist lens, is making sure our wages are high enough. It's very, very simple. We just want to get paid as much as possible. It doesn't really matter about the cultural trappings that surround that kind of stuff. In a pre-neoliberal world, though, because there was that class was far more cultural and had more kind of community aspect to it, that wasn't that individual atomization wasn't really the case. And that's the kind of environment that boomers and Gen Xers were brought up into to think about class. But that doesn't exist for millennials and Zoomers, because a lot of the institutions have been eroded and or have been made better in the advent of the new Labour government of the 1997 to 2010. But a lot of the other stuff all the cultural links and communitarian links, they've all been broken down. And the media, they don't seem to understand this. They don't understand this at all. So actually, what really has happened is that the class divide, if you're looking specifically between what one might call middle class and one might call working class in a traditional perspective, this is now the age divide. To take the story back, the big thing that happened in the 1980s was right to buy, where council housing was sold off by the Thatcher government, wasn't replaced, and that all went into the private sector. Basically, they're mostly all owned by landlords now, but it essentially gifted a section of the working class who used to rely on council housing. They gifted them asset wealth, which essentially gave them, through deliberate policy platform by the Thatcher government, it gifted them the ability to be able to move through class strata. It gifted them social mobility basically out of nowhere, because suddenly their material interests changed from only having to care about making sure they earned as much money as possible. It then changed to be, now I need to inflate my house price as much as possible because you have a material interest in increasing your own asset wealth. And that is one of the main differences, I would say, in a material sense between middle class and working class people, especially in the world in which how much asset wealth you own in the form of your house is your biggest way of being able to accrue quote-unquote unearned wealth, right? I hate talking about that when it comes to something like your house, but that's just the way it is at the moment, right? I am now a homeowner. In the period between when I first actually got the deeds to my house signed, right? I first get on the housing ladder, my house price has increased in a single year more than I earned working my job. So I'm now probably pretty safely middle class now. I'm a homeowner within that kind of lens. And as you say, Bilderberg in chat, young people with good salaries do struggle to afford being able to get onto the housing ladder, and so you stay in a kind of proletarian position through a Marxist lens when you look at this kind of stuff. Because young people never got access to the right to buy the working class kind of Gen Xers and boomers got during the 1980s. They got gifted social mobility. So even though they culturally see themselves as working class, because that's how they grew up, they've been gifted social mobility that now is not available to everybody else. So they don't see themselves as being middle class, because to them, it is community-based. It is about where you grew up, the cultural things that surround you. That is what defines your class to them. because it was always been defined that way previously, and neoliberalism, well, the kind of main thrust of neoliberalism hadn't been the kind of dominant economic narrative of the time. People hadn't been whittled down to and atomized to individuals at that point. And that's where this huge cultural divide comes from. And not only does that mean that all those people who then got on the housing ladder in that period, especially when we had high interest rates where house prices were very low, and how house prices shot up in the 1997 to 2010 period under Blair too, these people became richer and richer and richer. And there's an interesting graph, which I don't have on hand now, but I will try. It's on Twitter. I'll try and find it and pop it in the links in the down there part when I upload this video later on. When you look at the amount of individual property wealth and multiple property wealth over the Blair years and when they were in government, there's a little kind of U-curve where individual property wealth goes up and then goes back down again, and then multiple property wealth continues going up. So actually, there was a big spike in home ownership of people who got onto the housing ladder, but they actually, because of massively spiraling house prices, because this was the electoral coalition that Blair had built at the time. It stopped being about class politics and started becoming the pragmatic centre to try and woo liberal homeowners who'd essentially become Tory voters because of the right to buy policy. He had to woo these people to build the electoral coalition to try and become prime minister, and so he did. And to continue keeping hold of their vote, house prices had to continue to increase. Which means that it's hard for people to get onto the housing ladder to begin with. But if you're already on the housing ladder, getting a buy-to-let mortgage, getting your second mortgage when you have all of this property wealth already, when you've built all this credit score up as well, is far easier. So not only has property become more expensive, it's become more of most people's asset wealth over time. It's been harder and more competitive to be able to get onto the housing ladder to begin with, but easier to be able to concentrate more property wealth too. That's been creating an even bigger divide financially between the older generations and the younger generations. So younger generations aren't seeing this overall increase in asset wealth that the people before them did. And this shift in how people view class, how people actually engage their asset wealth, is another huge difference. So the reality is not only do young people are now far more incentivized to view class through a Marxist perspective rather than a classical British liberal perspective someone might view class by. The class divide is now the age divide. Some of the richest people in this country, or at least not the richest, but the most well off as far as income is concerned, are pensioners. Pensioners who got defined benefit pensions in the late 70s, early 80s, right? Then got phased out post Thatcher. They are now living so long because defined benefit pensions get better the longer than you live. Now, as we young people, we now get defined contribution pensions, which get worse the longer that you live. So we're actually having to pay by having even shittier pensions to pay for incredibly lucrative pensions people older than us. And what do you think? Where's all this pension money going to go? It's going to go into housing equity. Buy-to-let landlords are having to put rents up because their interest rates are going up, and buy-to-let mortgages are granted based on the yield of the property and rental income. Well, yeah, exactly. That's why I find it incredibly frustrating. And because of this huge group of people who essentially always have to be pandered to in electoral politics based upon ensuring that the house price increases. When we've been talking about the issues to do with the fallout from the mini-budget, from the fiscal event, we only ever talk about how it's going to impact mortgage holders. When was the last time you heard about how the increased cost of mortgages being pushed onto renters is going to affect them? We had one question in PMQs earlier. When we're having discussion, when we're looking at question time, the last question time episode that I watched, I brought this up and got very angry about it. And I will continue to get angry about it because renters just get left out of the picture because renters are going to vote fucking Labour. They have no one else to vote for, even though Labour aren't actually going to properly solve any of the issues that they need because they are too busy pandering to mortgage holders. Oh, land value tax, wonderful. Love land value tax. Let's go. Fully on board. I'm fully Georgism pilled at this point. But yeah, because of what's happened, because of the way in which material asset wealth, actually material wealth, and also just access to good wages, access to good standard of living has been gatekept from young people. I'm not surprised they're all fucking Marxists. I'm not surprised they're all socialists and communists. Why would I? In what? There's no reason why they wouldn't be. They've never been. None of the benefits of capitalism have ever been shown to them in the entirety of their adult life. And if you agree with Gary's economics, that unless a wealth tax happens, right, the longer we leave it before a wealth tax happens, poor people are going to get even more immiserated, and the rich poor the wealth gap between the rich and the poor is only going to increase. But whilst we still have a press and an older group of people who continue to hold on to an archaic view of class without looking at changing demographics, without looking at changing economic paradigms, without looking at the actual reality of the buying power of young people nowadays, that's going to continue to happen. Why do you think that boomers still live in this world of, well, if you just cut back on Netflix and avocado toast, you'd be able to buy a deposit? Because they just don't get it. And they don't get it because no one's ever told them. The media are literally see through the same lens. So yeah, this divide is only going to get bigger. It'll be interesting to see what happens when young people start inheriting from their parents. I'll be interested to see what happens then. But as far as I'm concerned, the only solution that we have to stopping a full-scale fucking revolution from young people in the future is you build a lot of social housing, and you're just going to have to take the hit on house prices at some point, and you're just going to have to institute huge amounts of wealth taxes on the rich. Well, actually, Bilderberg. I don't think the inheritance tax is going to be the killer. What I think is really going to be the killer is that the aging population is putting a huge strain on the NHS and a huge strain on social care, and we're not going to get. There's not going to be enough fuel into the exchequer to be able to properly fund the level of social care we need for our aging population. So what's actually going to happen is that the old people are going to sell off their additional property wealth or their whole property wealth to institutional investors who pay with cash, because those are going to be the people who can properly afford houses in a world of high mortgage rates, right? High house prices and high mortgage rates. The people who can afford to buy, the people who have cash. So older people are going to have to sell their houses to institutional investors who'll be able to pay for their own social care, which means house prices will continue to inflate. And young people will still not be on the housing ladder. Yeah, it is. We are literally sitting on a ticking time bomb of social care, of a social care collapse happening at some point. And yet old people are going to have to sell their houses for this shit. So yeah, young people are uniquely fucked. But no, Elon Musk will take us to Mars. Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture. But in general, I don't even know what the point I was trying to make. I was just like, if any boomers watching this when I upload to YouTube, please be nice to young people. Life's not like easy for us. I mean, it's easy for me now. I'm a homo now. I got on the ladder just at the right time, apparently. But I'm one of the lucky ones. Don't take my position as being the default when it is categorically is not. And you may believe, right, any boomers watching this, that you really worked hard for what you've got. Oh, and I don't doubt that you've not worked hard, right? I'm not telling you that you didn't work hard at all. But what you've got to understand is the position that you're in now, future boomer viewer, was given to you by specific economic policy that was used to coddle you, right? People always talk about millennials being entitled for wanting things like a roof and food and spending time with their friends, when really the properly entitled peoples are the boomers, because they have expected successive governments to kowtow to their will to increase the asset value of their house over and over and over again at the detriment of the rest of society. And if they don't get that, they throw their toys out the pram. And you'll see it right now. Tories screw up mortgage rates. Tories instantly out of the pram. Labour about like 50 points in the polls. Starting to see the early signs of that with whole Jeff Bezos giving money to Dolly on that weird interview. I mean, yeah, we're gonna get the liberal communists are gonna come out in force, aren't they? A la Zizek, when they realise what they've done. Jeff knows where we're coming from. Well, that's secret. I hate to take every single conversation and turn it into a discussion of the World Economic Forum, because a lot of people think, oh, hang on, all these people trying to humanize capitalism, there must be some kind of secret underlying global domination narrative they want to do. Well, actually, all they want to do is preserve capitalism as an institution. And they know, at least the World Economic Forum is smart enough to know, that unfettered neoliberal capitalism will not last forever, and the further it goes, the more likely they are at having some kind of violent and very bloody revolution. And to preserve capitalism, they have to kneecap capitalism. At least they have the smarts to realize that, even though they're only doing it to preserve their own future shareholder value, right? When they started talking about generational mortgages, like, what the fuck has it come to? Like 50-year mortgages. It's crazy shit, right? Because the entirety of our economy is just running on the fumes of house prices and the financial sector. We don't build anything. We don't make anything, right? And this is what, oh God, this is why you will see there's fucking incredibly irritating Marxists on the internet trying to tell you that service sector work isn't proletarian because it's not socially necessary labor, even though, how do you even quantify that in neoliberal capitalism? Anyway, whatever. That's but the reason why they're doing it is because they know that manufacturing is dead. In the UK and the US, both of us, manufacturing is dead because it's all been shipped overseas. That's the real reserve army of labour, is foreign workforces having being the place that does the manufacturing for us instead, right? And they refuse to recognise that service workers are proletarian, specifically because, not because of any actual Marxist theory, even though they try and think that it's Marxist in their theory, right? They'll try and find some passage that makes it, they can contort to try and look like that. But it's because they want to aesthetically distance themselves from the blue hair pronoun people, who they think are just everyone who works at Starbucks, apparently, which is incredibly fucking formative, very funny. But that's a story probably for another time. But in answer to your question, I think this is what got me onto it before. Like, will the Zoomers save us? And I think that they will. I really do think that they will, and I think we will have another Corbyn figure at some point in the future. The question is, it needs to be sooner rather than later, and we're running out of time. Gran gave her will to the state. Great Gran swapped her flat for care. Mum cut me out of the will. Fucking hell, blood doll. I'm sorry to hear it. But just cut some slack, boomers, please. It's tough out here being a millennial. I remember I think when new viewers come to my channel, the first recommended video they get is a video where I get incredibly angry at a man talking about how he's trying to teach his kids about financial security, when this is a guy who gets £6,000 a month from his pension and other investments that he has. I'm like, young kids aren't going to get that. To get his pension, I would have to retire at 88. So yeah, it's bleak, looking bleak out here. Your house is shared ownership, which is a great scheme for first-time buyers. 100%. Like, it's all the stories that you hear about how, look at these innovative solutions. And I'm just like, all the innovative solutions that young people are having at the moment is, we're too poor to do it normally, so we've come up with a hack to be able to sort it. And shared ownership is one of those things, right? It's like they're starting housing cooperatives. I'm like, yeah, we can't afford to own houses individually, so that's why we have housing cooperatives. And to be fair, housing cooperatives are based. They should entirely replace the private rented sector, especially when we look at HMOs and shit like that. Only found out today that Qatar owns more land in the UK than the King does. Our country is literally just selling everything just to get by. And again, because as long as it is boomer homeowners competing to increase house prices with institutional investors, right? The red line go up. The red line go up, and it's the same shit that you get with I was going to make this into a TikTok, but I'm going to say here instead, in that if you believe that markets are fundamentally the most efficient way of managing an economy or managing a society, the only way that you can come to that viewpoint is if your only metric for efficiency is making the number go up. Because these people, they don't have any possible understanding of overall utility, right? Because we look at the housing market is the most kind of obvious way of looking at it. Like when we've unfettered housing market, sure, the numbers have gone way up. If we've made the red line go to the fucking stratosphere, does that actually put people in houses at the end of the day? What narrative can we draw from this other than red line go up? Like, if everyone wants a good discussion about how economics measures things and when they're useful and when they're not, the very first video about unlearning economics called COVID-19 and Economic Narratives is really well worth watching, because it really does blow apart the fact that a lot of economics is just vibes, right? It's just vibes. Like we look at, CPI is really high. Well, what's CPI? An average basket plus rent plus what people could charge for rent for their mortgages if they did rent their house out. Is super fucking muddy and murky, and it's based on huge amounts of assumptions and guesswork, right? And loads of economics is this, and we use these fudges for the basis of huge kind of society-altering decisions without properly understanding the effective material utility of what you're engaging in. And I don't think people realize that quite a lot of the time. No worries, Morton. I'm glad to have you on stream. In the words of Sleaford Mods, it's bleak. Yep, 100%, 100%. Because, yeah, like, there's a really great Richard Wolff bit in his interview with Hakeem when he's talking about how, well, no, markets aren't always efficient, right? Take, for example, the Second World War. Sure, the markets would have been really efficient at distributing, for example, food to people who wanted to be able to pay for them to be able to maximize returns, right? But if it was the Second World War, where food is incredibly limited because huge amounts of the country's resources are being diverted towards the war effort, all of the small resources that we would have had would have been bought up by the people with all the money, and then they would have extorted the rest of the population at the time. That's why the governments at the time, who were incredibly pro-capitalist, like the coalition, the national government during the Second World War, decided to say, we're going to do rationing. We're going to dispense with the market because we realise the utility of not having the market in this case, right? And they realised that there was utility to that. And I would say, yes, let's take that and then think about which ways we can get maximum utility elsewhere. Because as a leftist, right, I'm not necessarily opposed to markets as a platform. Like, big fan of Yugoslavia, right? I've talked about I have a Tito emo. Like, of course, I'm a big fan of Yugoslavia, but I recognise that there are some things where markets are incredibly efficient and also have lots of utility. And one of those places that's not true is fucking housing. And I'm sorry, like, would I rather live in thousands of commie blocks, or this weird residential shit that we have going on, or American suburbia? And I'll take the commie blocks every fucking time. And we have the ability. We have the ability, and we have the money, and we have the know-how, and we have the technology to be able to build really good public housing. It exists in Europe. It exists in Africa. It exists in Asia. Does it exist in the UK? Does it exist in the United States? Like, fuck does it, right? Why have all of these countries managed to understand how to do proper social housing, right? It doesn't need to be the grotty tower blocks that we're used to. It doesn't need to be Magnitogorsk Part 2. Like, you look at the social housing in Austria, the social housing in Denmark, like Kenya, Vietnam, they have reasonable social housing, right? And in case of Austria and Denmark, incredible social housing. Bolivia has good social housing, right? We can just do this. It doesn't have to be what people think of in their mind's eye when you say social housing, when you say council housing. We can fix this. We can fix the issues that we have. But first of all, we have to get boomers to accept that they can't just have the house price increasing forever, and they have to fucking share. Just share the wealth that you got gifted through policy, right? I'm sure you worked very hard, boomers, But the reason why you're in the position that you're in is because of deliberate policy decisions. Deliberate policy decisions by the Thatcher government to turn you into Conservative voters. And it's a miracle that the Red Wall has lasted for this long, given how demographic changes happened over time. Sweden have good social housing too, yeah. The fact that a basic need in life like shelter is an investment is disgusting. We may as well privatise water. Oh wait, we already have done that. Sigh. It's pretty tilting. But housing is a big reason as to why the class divide is the age divide in this country. And I don't know how I slapped to get this together into a segment, but if you are watching the future segment, please do like and subscribe. Leave a comment calling me a fucking pinko commie cuck bitch. I don't know what you're gonna be rude in the comments. I give you full my blessing to be rude in the comments because it boosts the video in the algorithm. But if you want to become a member, you can become a member on YouTube for 99p, get you access to emotes that you can use as well. And if you click the bell, it'll notify you when I go live too.